How serious are Democrats about the idea of overturning our constitutional order? Pretty serious.
Massive judicial reform, state by state and at the federal level, and everything should be on the table as far as I'm concerned.
I'm Rich Lowry of National Review, and of course that was the Democratic leader of the House, Hakeem Jeffries, talking about this radical idea to totally remake the Supreme Court and courts at the state level in what would be tantamount to the destruction of the American constitutional order, which depends on an independent judiciary, which Democrats are no longer interested in because it's not serving their partisan interests at the moment. Now, that so many Democrats are thinking this way and talking about it openly, for me, is a sign that 2028 will really be a Flight 93 election. If you remember that famous essay from 2016 by a guy named Mike Anton saying that the stakes in 2016 were basically existential in the Hillary versus Trump race. I think that was hyperbole. It's good that Trump won. But I think in 28, we really may be facing a existential crisis of our system. So what's going on here? Well, Democrats believe the Supreme Court is illegitimate, it's corrupt, and they've worked themselves into a frothing lather over the Supreme Court's decision in the Louisiana racial gerrymandering case. Here's Cory Booker the other day.
This is wrong. It's as wrong as Plessy versus Ferguson. It's as wrong as Korematsu. And I'm telling you right now, this will go down as history as one of the most wrong-headed decisions the Supreme Court has ever made and effectively undercut our democracy.
What is he talking about? Plessy v. Ferguson, one of the most notorious decisions in the history of the Supreme Court, creating the doctrine or blessing the doctrine of separate but equal, justifying racially segregated facilities, public facilities in the United States. This is like the gerrymandering decision that says you can't draw districts on the basis of race. These two things don't go together. And after this decision, as before it in Louisiana, Black voters will be as free as they've ever been to participate in our electoral politics and go to the voting booth, just like everyone else. So this is rank hysteria. And then Korematsu, really? A decision that approved of the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II? No one is being interned here. Black voters aren't going to be sent to camps. None of that is happening. This is so crazy. And if you'll indulge me to stick with Booker for just one more second, here's another particularly dumb point.
So first of all, this court is profoundly hypocritical. They said you can use race in immigration stops. So this is not about race. This is about stripping political power from millions of people. And obviously this decision would result, and they knew this, in stripping political power and representation from African Americans.
So let's pause there, because they just throw this stuff out, assuming no one will really know what they're talking about, let alone go back and check. And what he's saying is so ridiculous. We can be almost certain, the reference is a little vague, that he's referring to a Kavanaugh concurrence in a recent Supreme Court decision having to do with a district judge in California who ordered immigration officers to stop making immigration stops based on certain factors. Our old friend at the Center for Immigration Studies, Art Arthur, explained this very well. Let me quote him really briefly here. This judge ruled against immigration stops based on the following factors: a combination of factors: presence at a particular location, the type of work the individual is doing, the individual speaking Spanish or speaking English with an accent, the individual's apparent race or ethnicity. Now, what the judge said there is not really in keeping with the Immigration and Nationality Act, which gives pretty expansive powers to immigration officers to stop people they think are illegal immigrants. Anyway, the Supreme Court stayed the judge's injunction, and in his concurrence, Kavanaugh wrote this: under this court's precedents, not to mention common sense, the factors identified by the judge taken together can constitute at least reasonable suspicion of illegal presence in the United States. So that's it. What that basically says is if you're an immigration officer looking for illegal immigrants from, say, El Salvador, based on a number of factors, you conclude someone could be an illegal immigrant from El Salvador, including that he seems like he's from El Salvador, you can make a stop. That's it. That's not Plessy v. Ferguson either, and does nothing to invalidate the broader constitutional principle that we shouldn't be making public policy on the basis of race, and congressional districts drawn on the basis of race are unconstitutional. But progressives can't abide this. They are highly vested in the current racially based districts because they think it serves their partisan interest, and they are now out of their mind, totally lunatic about the courts and the Supreme Court in particular. Here's James Carville, who's a colorful figure, very vulgar mouth, but in the scheme of things, is a relatively moderate and pragmatic Democrat, completely going off.
You cannot reform. This is an irredeemably corrupt Supreme Court that cannot be reformed through normal measures. It can only be reformed by adding 4 more members, which is constitutionally permissible to do with a legislative majority. It's the only fucking thing you can do with these people.
So he makes it sound as though this is just a mere matter of addition. What's 4? 4 is not a very big number, right? If you go to the grocery store and you put 9 apples in your produce bag and you add 4 more, what's the big deal? You've gone from 9 to 13. Who cares? But of course, with the Supreme Court, this would change everything and fundamentally undermine its legitimacy. Progressives talk about the court having no legitimacy. This would absolutely guarantee that it has no legitimacy any longer because we have a longstanding process for how we select justices, and how seats become open. And no one can guarantee who's going to get a justice. You have to win presidential elections, and you have to have some fortunate timing. This would totally change that, throw that out, and add 4 justices that Republicans would have no chance to influence. The whole idea would be to eliminate any chance that these would be constitutionalist conservatives on the court, and instead stack it, pack it with 4 more progressives to overturn everything that can be overturned that the court has done in recent years that Democrats don't like, and rule in Democrats' favor no matter what the law says or the Constitution says going forward. At that point, why would anyone listen to the Supreme Court? So we'd have this element of our constitutional system that would be destroyed. And that's not the only institution James Carville wants to go after and rig.
Democrats win the presidency, the Senate, and the House in 2028, which is not impossible. I don't know if you say likely or possible. I don't know what word but it's certainly not impossible. They are just going to have to unilaterally add Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia states. They're going to have to, the Congress does give, the Constitution gives Congress power over federal elections. I don't think they can redistrict, but they're things they go do. They're going to have to do it. They're just going to have to do it.
Again, just four additional senators. What's the big deal? But of course, very often, 4 senators make the difference between which party is in the majority and which is in the minority. And what he wants is to guarantee that Democrats are in the majority, because these wouldn't be swing states, the new states of D.C. and Puerto Rico. These would be, as much as they could be, guaranteed Democratic seats. In our tradition, when we're adding states, you add a Democratic state, you add a Republican state to balance it out. And who knows, the partisan nature of the states can change over time, obviously, but that's not the idea here. We're not going to have balance. We're not going to have 1 Democrat, 1 Republican state. No, 2 new Democratic states for 4 guaranteed new Senate seats, also undermining legitimacy of the Senate. And the justification here is very telling. More Carville.
If you want to save democracy, I think you got to do all of those things, because we just are moving further and further away from being anything close to democracy.
That's very telling, right? Because in his own mind, this is all just about defending democracy. But what's the event that he most objects to that happened over the last year or two? It's Donald Trump won a free and fair election in 2024. It'd be one thing if he'd stayed in power after losing the 2020 election. That didn't, thank God, happen. But he won a fair and square election against Kamala Harris in 2024. And that's what Carville finds intolerable. And by the way, where did these Supreme Court justices that he so objects to come from? They were appointed and confirmed in adherence with a long established practice. And by the way, he might not like their judicial philosophy, but they all have in the majority, a clear and discernible judicial philosophy. You can argue this case or that case. Maybe they haven't followed it the way you would have liked, or maybe a slightly different conclusion would have been called for. But there's no doubt that there is a coherence to their judicial philosophy, and hewing to the Constitution as written and to statutes as written is obviously the right approach. But Carville doesn't want to hear any of that, because he thinks all this stuff going the wrong way, the election, Supreme Court decisions, means democracy is under threat. Democracy defined as inherently capital letter Democrats getting everything they want, which brings us back to the notion of this Flight 93 election and this famous essay in the Claremont Review of Books in 2016. Now, again, the idea was if Donald Trump didn't win in 2016, you just should turn out the lights on the American Republic. There'd be no recovering from that, which is obviously an overstatement. Whatever her many flaws, and obviously there are many of them, Hillary Clinton was a moderate compared to what we're hearing from Democrats today. But let's think about 2028. Let's say they get a big majority in the Senate and the House, they elect a president of the United States, and they pack the Supreme Court. What would happen then? Well, I don't think there's any reason anyone should listen to a Supreme Court going forward in that circumstance. So you'd have these big questions that the court would, in theory, decide, but people would feel no obligation to follow these decisions or might actively defy these decisions, which sets up a predicate for a spiral of social and civil conflict of the sort we haven't seen since the Civil War. If this were to come about, it would undermine our wealth, obviously undermine our coherence as a country, undermine our power. It would be a debacle from which it might be very difficult to recover from, which is why 2028 might indeed be the Flight 93 election. I'm Rich Lowry, over and out.